In the world of military training, there are legends that echo through the corridors of boot camps and recruit depots across America. Stories of drill instructors who could break down the toughest recruits with a single glance, tales of impossible physical feats, and accounts of transformation that seem to defy human nature. But sometimes, the most extraordinary stories come from the most unexpected places. This is the story of Sarah Martinez, a woman who worked at a small daycare center in a forgotten corner of North Carolina, and how one single shot changed everything anyone thought they knew about strength, precision, and what it truly means. To command respect, before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Martinez never imagined herself as anything special. Standing 5 feet 4 inches tall with gentle brown eyes and a warm smile that could calm the most restless child, she spent her days at Little Angels Daycare in Jacksonville, North Carolina. For 8 years, she had been the anchor of stability for dozens of military families whose children needed care while their parents served at nearby Camp Lejeune. To the outside world, she was simply Miss Sarah, the patient woman who could tie tiny shoes, wipe away tears, and somehow manage to keep 30 energetic children engaged during story time. But Sarah carried secrets that even she didn't fully understand. Her childhood in rural Montana had been spent on her grandfather's ranch, where survival meant knowing how to handle a rifle before you could properly ride a bicycle. Her grandfather, a World War II veteran who had seen action in the Pacific theater, had taught her that accuracy wasn't just about hitting targets. It was about discipline, breath control, and understanding the weight of responsibility that came with every squeeze of the trigger. The daycare sat just 15 minutes from Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune, one of the largest Marine Corps installations in the United States. Every morning, Sarah would arrive to find parents in camouflage uniforms dropping off their children, many of whom were preparing for deployments that would take them thousands of miles from home. These weren't ordinary parents. They were Marines, sailors, and soldiers who had been trained to be the best fighting force in the world. Yet here they were, trusting their most precious possessions to a quiet woman who seemed to possess some sort of magical ability to make chaos disappear. The children adored her. Tommy, whose father was a Marine sergeant, would run to her arms every morning and refuse to let go. Maria, whose mother was deploying to Afghanistan, had stopped speaking to everyone except Sarah. And little Jake, who had been having nightmares about his father's upcoming deployment, would only fall asleep during nap time if Sarah sat beside his cot and hummed old country songs. Her grandfather had taught her, but it was Sarah's interaction with the military parents that began to reveal something extraordinary. When Captain Rodriguez, a Marine Corps officer, mentioned that his unit was struggling with marksmanship scores and asked if Sarah knew anyone who might help with civilian marksmanship training, she quietly mentioned that she had some experience with firearms. When Staff Sergeant Johnson complained that his new recruits couldn't seem to grasp the fundamentals of breath control and trigger discipline, Sarah found herself offering insights that surprised even her. "You know, Staff Sergeant," she said one afternoon as she helped him carry his son's backpack to the car, "my grandfather used to say that the best shooters weren't necessarily the strongest or the fastest. They were the ones who could find stillness in the middle of chaos." Maybe your recruits are trying too hard to be perfect instead of just learning to be present. Staff Sergeant Johnson paused, studying the daycare worker with new interest. "That's actually very insightful, Miss Sarah. Have you ever considered that maybe you're wasting your talents here?" Sarah laughed, but there was something in the Marine's eyes that made her wonder if he was seeing something she had never recognized in herself. "I'm not wasting anything, Staff Sergeant. These children need someone who understands that strength isn't always about being the loudest person in the room." What Sarah didn't know was that her reputation was beginning to spread through the tight-knit military community. Parents would go home and tell their spouses about the remarkable woman, who not only managed their children with ease, but seemed to understand military culture in ways that surprised veteran service members. Word began to filter through the base that there was a civilian employee at Little Angels Daycare who possessed insights that even drill instructors found valuable. The truth was, Sarah had been quietly observing military families for years. She had learned to read the signs of stress that came with deployments, the way children process separation anxiety, and the unique challenges that military families faced. But more than that, she had developed an uncanny ability to identify what people needed most, whether it was a homesick recruit who needed encouragement, a worried parent who needed reassurance, or a child who needed to feel safe in an uncertain world. Her grandfather's lessons had shaped her in ways she was only beginning to understand. The discipline required to wake up at 5:30 every morning. The patience needed to teach the same lesson dozens of times until every child understood. The mental toughness required to remain calm when chaos erupted. These were skills that translated far beyond the walls of a daycare center. One particular morning in early September, Sarah arrived at work to find an unusual sight. A Marine Corps van was parked outside the daycare, and 3 drill instructors in their distinctive campaign hats were standing near the entrance, talking in hushed tones. Their posture was unmistakable, ramrod straight, hands clasped behind their backs, eyes constantly scanning their surroundings with the hyper-vigilance that came from years of training. These weren't parents dropping off children. These were Marines on official business. Sarah's heart began to race as she approached the entrance. Had something happened to one of the children? Was there a security threat? The drill instructors turned as she approached, and their expressions were unreadable behind their trademark stoic masks. "Miss Martinez?" The tallest of the 3, a gunnery sergeant with numerous ribbons on his chest, stepped forward. "I'm Gunnery Sergeant Hayes. We'd like to have a word with you." Sarah nodded, maintaining the calm demeanor that had served her well in countless challenging situations. "Of course, Gunnery Sergeant. Is everything all right?" "Ma'am, we've been hearing some interesting things about you from the parents whose children attend this facility. Things that suggest you might have some unique insights into marksmanship training." The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah felt the weight of 3 pairs of eyes studying her, looking for any sign of weakness or deception. This was how drill instructors operated. They were constantly evaluating, constantly testing, constantly pushing to find the limits of human potential. "I'm not sure what you mean, Gunnery Sergeant," Sarah replied carefully. "I work with children. I'm not a military instructor." "No, ma'am, you're not. But you are someone who has been giving advice to our Marines that has proven remarkably effective. Staff Sergeant Johnson's marksmanship scores have improved dramatically since he started implementing some techniques you suggested. Captain Rodriguez's unit has been asking specifically about breath control methods you described." Sarah felt a flush of embarrassment. She had never intended for her casual conversations to be taken as formal instruction. "I was just sharing some things my grandfather taught me. I didn't mean to overstep any boundaries." "Ma'am, you didn't overstep anything. You helped our Marines become better shooters. That's something we take very seriously." "Gunnery Sergeant." Hayes paused, studying her with the intensity that had intimidated countless recruits. "We'd like to invite you to observe a training exercise. See what you think about our current marksmanship programs." The invitation was unprecedented. Civilian contractors and military spouses sometimes observed training exercises, but a daycare worker being personally invited by drill instructors to evaluate Marine Corps marksmanship training? This was unheard of. Sarah felt the weight of the moment. This was more than just an invitation, it was a test. These drill instructors had built their careers on their ability to identify potential, to spot the qualities that separated good Marines from great ones. If they were interested in her observations, it meant they had seen something in her that even she didn't fully recognize. When would this be, Gunnery Sergeant? This Saturday, 0800 hours. We'll be conducting live fire exercises with a group of new recruits who are struggling with basic marksmanship fundamentals. Your insights could be valuable. Sarah nodded slowly. Saturday was her day off, and she had planned to spend it working in her garden and reading. But something in the drill instructor's tone told her this was an opportunity that might not come again. I'll be there, Gunnery Sergeant. As the three Marines walked away, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. She had no idea that she was about to step into a world that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself, and that within hours, she would demonstrate skills that would leave some of the Marine Corps' most experienced instructors speechless. The daycare children began arriving shortly after, and Sarah threw herself into her usual routine of breakfast preparation, activity planning, and the countless small tasks that kept 30 children happy and engaged. But throughout the day, her mind kept returning to the invitation. What exactly did the drill instructors expect from her? What could a daycare worker possibly offer to Marine Corps marksmanship training? That evening, Sarah drove home to her small apartment and called her grandfather in Montana. At 87, he was still sharp, still living independently on the ranch where she had spent her childhood summers learning to shoot. "Grandpa, I need some advice," she said, settling into her favorite chair with a cup of tea. "What's on your mind, little bird?" His voice was warm and familiar, carrying the same gentle strength that had guided her through countless childhood challenges. Sarah explained the situation, the invitation from the drill instructors, her nervousness about being evaluated by some of the Marine Corps' most experienced trainers, her uncertainty about whether she had anything valuable to offer. Her grandfather was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of experience that came from decades of teaching and learning. "Sarah, I've been waiting for this call for years. You have a gift, but you've been hiding it behind your fear of standing out. Those Marines didn't invite you because they felt sorry for you. They invited you because they recognized something special. The question is, are you ready to stop being afraid of who you really are?" The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her grandfather had always been able to see through her carefully constructed walls, to identify the fears and insecurities that she kept hidden from the world. "But Grandpa, what if I embarrass myself? What if I can't perform when it matters? These are professional military instructors. They've trained thousands of Marines. What could I possibly teach them?" "You could teach them the same thing I taught you, that the best shooting comes from the heart, not from the head. That accuracy is about finding peace in the middle of chaos. That true strength isn't about intimidation or volume, but about quiet confidence and unwavering focus." Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes. Her grandfather had been her first and most important teacher, the person who had shown her that being gentle didn't mean being weak, that being quiet didn't mean being invisible. "Tell me about the Marines you work with," he continued. "What do you see when you look at them?" Sarah thought about the parents who drop their children off each morning. "I see people who are carrying enormous responsibilities. They're trained to be tough, to project strength, to never show weakness. But when they hug their children goodbye, I see the same fears and hopes that every parent has. They're human beings who happen to be warriors." And what do you think those drill instructors see when they look at their recruits? Raw material that needs to be shaped. People who need to be transformed from civilians into Marines. Exactly. And what do you see when you look at the children in your care? Sarah paused, considering the question. "I see individuals who each have their own unique strengths and challenges. I see people who need guidance, but also respect. I see potential that needs to be nurtured, not broken down." Her grandfather's voice was gentle but firm. "That's the difference, little bird. Those drill instructors have been trained to see weaknesses that need to be corrected. You've been trained to see strengths that need to be developed. Both approaches have value, but yours might be exactly what they need to hear. After hanging up with her grandfather, Sarah spent the evening cleaning her grandfather's old rifle, a pristine M1 Garand that had been passed down through 3 generations of her family. She had maintained it carefully over the years, but it had been months since she had actually fired it. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, she would step into a world where her skills would be tested in ways she had never imagined. She went to bed that night with a mixture of excitement and terror, knowing that the next day would either confirm her grandfather's faith in her abilities or reveal that she had been living with illusions about her own skills. Either way, she was about to discover truths about herself that would change her life forever. Saturday morning arrived with the crisp coolness of early autumn in North Carolina. Sarah stood in front of her bathroom mirror at 6:30 a.m. trying to decide what to wear to a Marine Corps training exercise. She had never been in this situation before. What exactly did one wear to observe military marksmanship training? She settled on dark jeans, a plain black t-shirt, and comfortable boots, wanting to blend in rather than stand out. The drive to Camp Lejeune took her through familiar territory, but everything felt different this morning. Instead of heading to the daycare center where she spent her days nurturing children, she was driving toward a world of precision, discipline, and the controlled violence that was the foundation of military training. Her grandfather's M1 Garand rested in a padded case in her trunk, cleaned and ready, though she had no idea whether she would actually have a chance to fire it. The entrance to the base was busier than usual, with Marines in various uniforms moving with the purposeful efficiency that characterized military life. Sarah presented her identification to the guard at the gate, who checked her name against a list and waved her through with a crisp, "Have a good day, ma'am." Following the directions Gunnery Sergeant Hayes had provided, Sarah drove toward the FIRING range complex. The facility was larger than she had expected, multiple ranges stretching into the distance, each designed for different types of training. She could already hear the distinctive crack of rifle fire echoing across the landscape. A Marine in dress blue uniform directed her to a parking area near the main range, where she could see approximately 30 recruits in formation, listening to instructions from 2 drill instructors. Even from a distance, she could sense the tension in the air, the kind of focused energy that came from young people trying desperately to meet impossible standards. Gunnery Sergeant Hayes appeared at her car window as she was gathering her courage to step out. "Miss Martinez, glad you could make it. We're about to begin the live fire exercise. I'd like you to observe the first group, and then we'll talk about what you see." Sarah nodded, grabbing her notebook and water bottle. The September morning was pleasant, but she could already feel perspiration on her palms. This was unlike anything she had ever done. The firing range was a marvel of organized chaos. 30 individual firing positions were laid out in a precise line, each equipped with sandbags, shooting mats, and targets positioned at various distances. The recruits, most of whom looked barely old enough to vote, were moving through the complex ritual of preparing for live ammunition training. "Listen up, recruits." The voice of Staff Sergeant Williams, one of the drill instructors Sarah had met earlier, cut through the morning air like a blade. "Today we find out who has been paying attention during the past 3 weeks of marksmanship training, and who has been wasting the Marine Corps' time and ammunition." The recruits snapped to attention, their movements synchronized but slightly awkward, the result of weeks of intensive training that hadn't yet become second nature. Sarah found herself studying their faces, looking for the subtle signs of stress and anxiety that she had learned to recognize in her work with children. "You will approach your firing positions in an orderly manner. You will assume the prone position. You will load 1 round into your weapon. You will acquire your target. You will fire when I give the command. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir." The response was thunderous, but Sarah noticed that several of the recruits' voices cracked slightly under the pressure, What followed was a masterclass in military precision. The recruits moved to their positions with mechanical efficiency, following procedures that had been drilled into them through countless hours of dry fire practice. But Sarah could see the tension in their movements, the slight tremor in hands, the elevated breathing, the way their eyes darted nervously between their rifles and the drill instructors. Assume the prone position. 30 bodies dropped to the ground in unison, taking up shooting positions behind their rifles. Sarah watched as they struggled to find comfortable positions, adjusting and readjusting their stances in ways that suggested they were fighting their own nervousness. Load 1 round. The mechanical sound of 30 bolts being operated filled the air. Sarah noticed that several of the recruits' hands were shaking slightly as they loaded their ammunition. Acquire your target. Sarah moved to a position where she could observe the firing line more clearly. Through her years of experience with her grandfather's careful instruction, she could immediately see the problems. The recruits were trying too hard, gripping their rifles with white-knuckled intensity, their breathing shallow and rapid. They were treating the exercise like a life-or-death situation rather than a skill to be mastered. Fire! The volley of rifle fire was deafening, even with the ear protection Sarah had been provided. 30 muzzle flashes erupted simultaneously, and the acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air. But even before the targets were scored, Sarah could tell that the results would be disappointing. The drill instructors moved behind the firing line, examining the targets through spotting scopes. Their expressions were not encouraging. Cease fire. Make your weapons safe. The recruits went through the process of clearing their rifles, but the tension in the air was palpable. Sarah could see defeat in their posture, the slumped shoulders and downcast eyes of people who knew they had failed to meet expectations. Staff Sergeant Williams approached with a target in his hand, his face grim. Miss Martinez, this is typical of what we're seeing. Out of 30 shots, we had 8 hits on target. Of those 8 hits, only 2 were in the scoring rings. These recruits have had 3 weeks of intensive marksmanship training, and they're performing like they've never seen a rifle before. Sarah studied the target, noting the wide spread of bullet holes, many of which were scattered far from the intended point of impact. But instead of seeing failure, she saw something else. A pattern that reminded her of the way children behaved when they were overwhelmed by pressure. Staff Sergeant, may I ask you something? Of course, ma'am. When these recruits were learning to march, did they master it on the first day? Staff Sergeant Williams looked puzzled. No, ma'am. It took weeks of practice before they could maintain proper formation and timing. And when they were learning to make their beds to Marine Corps standards, did they get it right immediately? No, ma'am. That also took considerable practice and correction. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. But with marksmanship training, you're expecting them to perform under pressure after just 3 weeks, while being watched by drill instructors who are famous for their ability to identify failure. The drill instructor's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of interest replacing his earlier frustration. What exactly are you suggesting, Miss Martinez? Sarah looked back at the recruits, who were still in prone positions, waiting for their next instructions. I'm suggesting that they're not failing because they don't understand the mechanics of shooting. They're failing because they're terrified of disappointing you. Ma'am, fear is part of military training. These recruits need to learn to perform under pressure. I understand that, Staff Sergeant. But there's a difference between productive pressure and paralyzing fear. Right now, these young people are so focused on not making mistakes that they can't focus on making good shots. Gunnery Sergeant Hayes had been listening to the conversation, and now he stepped forward. Miss Martinez, what would you do differently? Sarah felt 31 pairs of eyes focused on her, the drill instructors, the recruits, and several other Marines who had gathered to observe the exercise. This was the moment she had been dreading and anticipating since accepting the invitation. May I demonstrate something, Gunnery Sergeant? By all means. Sarah walked to an unoccupied firing position and knelt beside one of the spare rifles. "May I borrow this weapon?" "Of course. Staff Sergeant Williams will provide you with ammunition." Sarah accepted the rifle, an M16A4 that was standard issue for Marine Corps training. She had never fired this exact model before, but the fundamentals were the same as every rifle her grandfather had taught her to shoot. She took a few moments to familiarize herself with the weapon, checking the sights and getting a feel for the trigger. "I'm going to take one shot at the target," she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the range. "But before I do, I want to show these recruits something about breathing." Sarah settled into the prone position, her movements fluid and natural. Unlike the recruits, who had fought to find comfortable positions, she seemed to flow into the shooting stance as if she had done it thousands of times before. "The secret isn't to stop breathing," she said, her voice calm and conversational. "It's to breathe naturally and fire at the natural pause between breaths. Watch my chest." The range had become completely silent. Even the drill instructors were. Leaning forward, studying her technique with professional interest, Sarah took 3 deep, slow breaths, letting her body settle into the position. On the 3rd breath, she exhaled halfway, let her breathing pause naturally, and gently squeezed the trigger. The rifle fired, and the sound seemed to echo forever in the sudden silence that followed. Staff Sergeant Williams looked through the spotting scope, his eyes widening in surprise. "Dead center," he called out. "Perfect bullseye." A murmur ran through the assembled recruits, but Sarah wasn't finished. She remained in position, cycling the bolt to chamber another round. "The second secret," she continued, "is that accuracy comes from consistency, not from trying to be perfect. I'm going to fire 4 more shots, and I want you to watch how I prepare for each one exactly the same way." What followed was a demonstration that would be talked about in Marine Corps training circles for years to come. Sarah fired 4 more rounds in rapid succession, each shot identical to the last in terms of preparation and execution. Her breathing was steady, her movements economical, and her focus absolute. When Staff Sergeant Williams examined the target, his voice was hushed with amazement. 5 shots, 5 bullseyes. The entire group could be covered with a quarter. The silence that followed was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. 30 young Marines stared at her with expressions ranging from awe to disbelief. The drill instructors looked at each other as if they were witnessing something that challenged their understanding of how marksmanship training was supposed to work. Gunnery. Sergeant Hayes was the first to speak. "Miss Martinez, that was extraordinary. I've been training Marines for 15 years, and I've never seen a civilian shoot like that." Sarah stood up, brushing dirt from her jeans. "Gunnery Sergeant, I'm not a better shot than your recruits. I'm just not afraid of disappointing you." The moment after Sarah's 5th perfect shot was unlike anything the Marines had experienced in their training. It wasn't just quiet, it was the kind of profound silence that follows a revelation, when everything everyone thought they knew suddenly shifts into a new perspective. Gunnery. Sergeant Hayes had been a Marine for 18 years. He had served in Iraq and Afghanistan, had trained thousands of recruits, and had earned a reputation as one of the most effective marksmanship instructors in the Corps. But he had never seen anything like what had just happened. Sarah Martinez, a daycare worker who stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, had just outshot every Marine on the range with a weapon she had never used before, using techniques that seemed to contradict everything the Marine Corps taught about high-pressure performance. "Miss Martinez," Gunnery Sergeant Hayes said slowly, "would you mind explaining what just happened here?" Sarah looked around at the faces staring at her. 30 young recruits who had been struggling with basic marksmanship for weeks, 3 drill instructors who had built their careers on their ability to teach shooting, and several other Marines who had gathered to witness what was quickly becoming legendary. "I treated it like any other skill I teach," Sarah said simply. When I'm working with children who are learning to read, I don't start by testing them in front of everyone while I stand over them looking for mistakes. I start by helping them feel safe enough to learn. Staff Sergeant Williams stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. But ma'am, these aren't children. These are Marine recruits who need to learn to perform under pressure. Staff Sergeant. With respect, they are children. Most of them are 18 or 19 years old. They're away from home for the first time, surrounded by people who are paid to find their weaknesses, carrying weapons that could kill someone if they make a mistake. They're terrified, and fear is the enemy of accuracy. The truth of her words hung in the air like a challenge. Every Marine on the range knew she was right, but acknowledging it meant questioning training methods that had been used for decades. So what are you suggesting? Gunnery Sergeant Hayes asked. Sarah walked back to the firing line, where the recruits were still in prone positions, waiting for instructions. May I try something with them? Please do. Sarah knelt beside the first recruit, a young man whose name tag read Patterson. His hands were still shaking slightly, and she could see the tension in his shoulders. Patterson, what's your first name? Michael, ma'am. Where are you from, Michael? Ohio, ma'am. Small town outside of Columbus. Did you hunt with your family back home? Patterson's face brightened slightly. Yes, ma'am. My dad and I used to go deer hunting every fall. Did you hit what you were aiming at? Most of the time. Ma'am, Sarah nodded. So you know how to shoot. The problem isn't your skill, it's your environment. Right now, you're not thinking about hitting the target. You're thinking about not disappointing the drill instructors. Is that accurate? Patterson's eyes flicked nervously toward the drill instructors before returning to Sarah. Yes, ma'am. That's exactly what I was thinking. Here's what we're going to do. I want you to forget about everyone watching you. I want you to pretend you're back in Ohio with your dad, and there's a deer at the edge of the clearing. You have one shot to make sure your family has meat for the winter. Nothing else matters except making that shot count. Sarah's voice had dropped to a conversational tone, and Patterson seemed to relax slightly as he listened. Now, take 3 deep breaths with me. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Let your body settle into the position. Feel the rifle become part of you, not something you're fighting against. Patterson followed her instructions, and Sarah could see the change in his posture. His grip on the rifle loosened, his breathing became more regular, and the tension in his shoulders began to dissipate. Good. Now when you're ready, not when I tell you, but when you're ready, take that shot. The range was completely silent as Patterson went through his preparation. Unlike his earlier attempt, his movements were smooth and deliberate. When he finally fired, the sound seemed less harsh, more controlled. Staff Sergeant Williams checked the target. Center ring. Excellent shot. A murmur of approval ran through the assembled recruits. But Sarah was already moving to the next position. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What followed was unlike anything anyone on the range had ever witnessed. One by one, Sarah worked with each recruit, not teaching them new techniques, but helping them remember skills they already possessed. She spoke to them as individuals, not as uniformed members of a training platoon. She asked about their backgrounds, their families, their reasons for joining the Marines. With Rodriguez, who had grown up in Los Angeles, she talked about the focus required to succeed in difficult environments. With Johnson, who had been a mechanic in civilian life, she discussed the precision required to fix complex machinery. With Thompson, who had never held a firearm before joining the Marines, she explained shooting in terms of the video games he had played for years. To each recruit, she offered the same fundamental insight. They already possessed the skills they needed. The challenge wasn't learning to shoot. It was learning to shoot while being watched, evaluated, and judged. The drill instructors watched in fascination as 30 young Marines who had been struggling with basic marksmanship began hitting their targets with increasing accuracy. More importantly, they could see the change in the recruits' demeanor. The fear and tension that had characterized their earlier attempts was replaced by focus and confidence. "Miss Martinez," Gunnery Sergeant Hayes said as Sarah worked with the last few recruits, "what you're doing here goes against everything we've been taught about military training. We've always believed that pressure creates diamonds." Sarah looked up from where she was kneeling beside a recruit named Williams. "Gunnery Sergeant, pressure can create diamonds, but it can also create dust. The difference is knowing when to apply pressure and when to provide support. But these Marines will face real combat situations. They need to be able to perform under the worst possible conditions." Sarah stood up, brushing dirt from her knees. "You're absolutely right, Gunnery Sergeant. But think about what we've accomplished. Here in the last hour, these recruits went from missing targets completely to hitting center mass consistently. Now they have confidence in their abilities. Now they know they can shoot accurately. When you add pressure back into the equation, they'll have a foundation of success to build on instead of a foundation of failure." The wisdom in her words was undeniable. Every drill instructor on the range had seen recruits who were caught in cycles of failure. The more they missed, the more nervous they became, the more they missed. Breaking that cycle was one of the most difficult challenges in military training. "So you're not suggesting we eliminate pressure from training," Staff Sergeant Williams said thoughtfully. "You're suggesting we build competence first, then add pressure gradually." "Exactly. In my work with children, I've learned that you can't teach someone who's afraid. Fear shuts down the learning process. But once someone knows they can succeed, they become much more resilient when facing challenges." Gunnery Sergeant Hayes looked at the targets that had been collected from the range. The improvement was dramatic and undeniable. Recruits who had been missing targets entirely an hour ago were now grouping shots in the center rings. "Miss Martinez, I have to ask, where did you learn to shoot like that? That demonstration you gave was beyond anything I've seen from civilian marksmanship." "Competitors." Sarah felt a flush of embarrassment. "My grandfather taught me. He was a Marine in World War II, served in the Pacific. After the war, he spent 50 years perfecting his shooting skills. He always said that the best shooting happened when you stopped trying to impress people and started focusing on the fundamentals." "Your grandfather was a Marine?" Staff Sergeant Williams looked surprised. "Yes, sir. He fought at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. He used to tell me stories about the Marines he served with, men who could hit targets at impossible distances, not because they were naturally gifted, but because they had learned to find calm in the middle of chaos." The drill instructors exchanged glances. This explained a lot about Sarah's understanding of military culture and her insights into training methodologies. "Miss Martinez," Gunnery Sergeant Hayes said slowly, "I think we need to have a longer conversation about your grandfather's training methods. What you've shown us here today could revolutionize how we approach marksmanship instruction." Sarah looked around the range, where 30 recruits were now cleaning their weapons with a confidence that had been absent that morning. "Gunnery Sergeant, I'm honored that you think my grandfather's methods might be helpful, but I'm not a military instructor. I'm a daycare worker. Ma'am, with respect, you're a teacher. The classroom might be different, but the principles are the same. You understand how people learn, how they respond to pressure, how to build confidence instead of tearing it down." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching vehicles. A Humvee and a staff car pulled up to the range, and several senior Marines emerged, including a colonel whose insignia indicated he was the commanding officer of the recruit training regiment. "Gunnery Sergeant Hayes," the colonel called out as he approached, "I've been hearing some interesting reports about this morning's exercise. Something about a civilian instructor who's been working with our recruits." Gunnery Sergeant Hayes came to attention. "Yes, sir. Colonel Martinez, this is Miss Sarah Martinez." She's been providing some insights into our marksmanship training methods. The colonel studied Sarah with the intense gaze that came from years of evaluating Marines. Miss Martinez, I understand you've been having some success with recruits who were struggling with basic marksmanship. Yes, sir. I was just sharing some techniques my grandfather taught me. Your grandfather? He was a Marine in World War II, sir. He served in the Pacific Theater. The colonel's expression shifted slightly. What was your grandfather's name, Miss Martinez? Staff Sergeant Roberto Martinez, sir. He served with the 3rd Marine Division. The colonel's eyes widened in recognition. Roberto Martinez? The Roberto Martinez who was awarded the Silver Star at Iwo Jima. Sarah felt a surge of pride and sadness. Yes, sir. He passed away 2 years ago. Miss Martinez, your grandfather was a legend in the Corps. His marksmanship skills were extraordinary, and his ability to train other Marines was equally impressive. I had the honor of meeting him at a veterans reunion several years ago. The revelation that Sarah was the granddaughter of a Marine Corps legend added a new dimension to everything that had happened that morning. Suddenly her insights weren't just the observations of a civilian daycare worker. They were the teachings of one of the Marine Corps' most respected warriors, passed down through a generation. Sir, Gunnery Sergeant Hayes said, Miss Martinez has demonstrated training methods that could significantly improve our marksmanship instruction. The recruits who were failing this morning are now hitting targets consistently. The colonel looked at the targets that had been collected from the range, his expression growing more interested with each one he examined. These are remarkable improvements. Miss Martinez, would you be willing to work with our training staff to develop a more comprehensive approach to marksmanship instruction? Sarah felt the weight of the moment. This was far beyond anything she had imagined when she accepted the invitation to observe a training exercise. Sir, I'm honored by the offer, but I'm not sure I'm qualified to train military instructors. Miss Martinez, you're the granddaughter of Staff Sergeant Roberto Martinez, trained by one of the finest Marines who ever lived. You've just demonstrated that you can take struggling recruits and turn them into competent marksmen in a matter of hours. I'd say you're more than qualified. The offer hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah looked around at the faces watching her, drill instructors who had spent their careers perfecting their craft, recruits who had found new confidence in their abilities, and senior Marines who were recognizing the potential for fundamental changes in how the Corps trained its warriors. This was the moment that would define not just Sarah's future, but potentially the future of Marine Corps marksmanship training. The quiet daycare worker was about to make a decision that would echo through the corridors of military installations across the country. But sir, I don't have any formal military training experience. I've never worked with adults in a professional capacity. I'm a daycare worker. Gunnery Sergeant Hayes stepped forward. Ma'am, with respect, you've just demonstrated more effective training techniques in 2 hours than most instructors develop in years of service. What you do with children, building confidence, creating safe learning environments. Sarah stood in the center of the firing range, surrounded by Marines who were waiting for her answer to a question that could change her life forever. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, and the North Carolina heat was beginning to build, but she barely noticed the temperature. Her mind was racing through possibilities she had never imagined. Sir, she said carefully, may I ask what exactly you're proposing? Colonel Martinez, no relation, despite the shared surname, clasped his hands behind his back in the classic military posture. Miss Martinez, what I'm proposing is that you work with our training staff to develop a comprehensive program that incorporates your grandfather's methods with our existing curriculum. We're talking about potentially revolutionizing how the Marine Corps approaches marksmanship training. The magnitude of the proposal hit Sarah like a physical blow. This wasn't just about helping a few struggling recruits. This was about influencing how thousands of Marines would be trained for years to come. Focusing on individual needs. These are exactly the skills we need in military training. Sarah looked at the 30 recruits who were still cleaning their weapons. Each one of them had experienced a transformation that morning, moving from failure to success in a matter of hours. She could see it in their posture, in the way they handled their rifles, in the quiet confidence that had replaced the fear and anxiety that had characterized their earlier attempts. "What would this position involve?" she asked. "Initially, you would work as a civilian contractor," the colonel explained. "You would spend time with our drill instructors, sharing your techniques and helping them understand how to apply your methods to military training. Eventually, if things work out, we might look at creating a more permanent position." Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and terror. The opportunity was extraordinary, but it would mean leaving behind everything she had built at the daycare center. The children who depended on her, the routine that had given her life structure, the safe world where she understood her role and purpose. "Sir, I need to think about this. The children at the daycare center depend on me. I can't just abandon them." "Of course," the colonel said. "Take all the time you need. But Miss Martinez, I want you to understand something. What you've shown us today could save lives. Marines who can't shoot accurately in training are Marines who might not come home from combat. The skills you're teaching aren't just about hitting targets, they're about survival." The weight of that responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders like a heavy cloak. She had never thought of her teaching abilities in terms of life and death, but the colonel was right. In combat, marksmanship wasn't just a skill, it was the difference between survival and death. "There's something else you should know," Staff Sergeant Williams added. "The techniques you used today, the focus on building confidence, the individualized approach, the emphasis on mental preparation, these aren't just applicable to marksmanship. They could transform how we approach all aspects of military training." Sarah looked around the range one more time, taking in the faces of the Marines who were watching her. These weren't just soldiers. They were young people who had volunteered to serve their country, many of them barely out of high school, trying to master skills that could mean the difference between life and death in combat. "Can I ask you something, Colonel?" "Of course. If I were to take this position, would I have the authority to make real changes to training methods? Or would I just be advising while others make the decisions?" The colonel smiled for the first time that morning. "Miss Martinez, if you can consistently produce results like what we've seen today, you'll have all the authority you need." The Marine Corps values effectiveness above all else. Show us that your methods work and we'll give you the resources to implement them. Sarah nodded slowly. "I'll need to speak with my supervisor at the daycare center. And I'll need some time to think about this." "Take all the time you need," the colonel said. "But I hope you'll seriously consider this opportunity. The Marine Corps needs teachers like you." As the senior Marines departed, leaving Sarah alone with the drill instructors and recruits, she felt the weight of the decision before her. This was more than just a career change. It was a complete transformation of her identity and purpose. "Miss Martinez," Gunnery Sergeant Hayes said as the recruits began forming up for their return to barracks, "I want you to know that what you did here today was remarkable. I've been training Marines for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like it. Thank you, Gunnery Sergeant. But I want you to understand something. I didn't teach these recruits how to shoot. They already knew how to shoot. I just helped them remember that they could succeed." "That's exactly what made it so remarkable," Staff Sergeant Williams added. "You saw potential where we saw failure. You saw individuals where we saw problems to be solved." Sarah looked at the recruits, who were now standing in formation with a confidence that had been absent that morning. "Every person has the ability to succeed," she said quietly. "Sometimes they just need someone to believe in them long enough for them to believe in themselves." The drive back to her apartment was filled with thoughts that tumbled over each other in confusion and excitement. Sarah had always been comfortable with routine, with the predictability of her life at the daycare center. The idea of stepping into the unknown world of military training was both thrilling and terrifying. That evening, she called her grandfather's ranch in Montana, knowing that her grandmother would be the best person to help her think through this decision. "Grandma, I need some advice," she said after explaining everything that had happened that morning. Her grandmother was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah, honey, your grandfather always said that the most important moments in life are the ones that scare you the most. He was scared when he enlisted in the Marines. He was scared when he shipped out to the Pacific. He was scared every time he went into combat. But he did it anyway, because he knew it was the right thing to do. But Grandma, what if I fail? What if I'm not as good as they think I am? Baby girl, you've been teaching people your whole life. You've been using your grandfather's methods for years without even realizing it. The only difference is that now you'll be working with young Marines instead of young children." Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes. "I'm scared, Grandma." "Of course you are. But you know what your grandfather would say if he were here?" "What?" "He'd say that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite the fear. Those young Marines need what you have to offer. Your grandfather's legacy needs to live on. And you need to discover who you really are when you stop hiding behind what feels safe." After hanging up with her grandmother, Sarah sat in her small apartment, looking at the photos of her grandfather that covered one wall. There he was in his Marine dress blues, young and serious. There he was with his rifle, teaching a young Sarah how to sight a target. There he was in his later years, still proud, still carrying himself with the bearing of a Marine. She thought about the recruits she had worked with that morning, about the transformation she had witnessed in their confidence and abilities. She thought about the drill instructors who had been humble enough to admit that their methods might not be the only way to train Marines. She thought about the colonel's words about saving lives. By the time she went to bed that night, Sarah had made her decision. She would take the position with the Marine Corps, but she would do it on her own terms. She would bring her grandfather's methods to military training, but she would also bring her own insights about teaching and learning. She would honor her grandfather's legacy while creating her own. The next morning, Sarah called Colonel Martinez's office and accepted the position. Within a week, she would begin the most challenging and rewarding phase of her life, stepping into a world where her quiet strength would be tested in ways she had never imagined. But first, she had to have some difficult conversations with the children at the daycare center, explaining that Miss Sarah would be leaving to help train Marines, just like some of their parents. The hardest part wouldn't be leaving her comfortable routine. It would be helping 30 children understand that sometimes the people they depend on have to make difficult choices in order to help others. Sarah's first official day as a civilian contractor with the Marine Corps began at 0530 hours on a crisp October morning. She stood outside the gates of Camp Lejeune, wearing a visitor's badge and carrying a briefcase that contained her grandfather's training notes, photographs, and the carefully preserved manual he had written about marksmanship fundamentals during his post-war years. The transition from daycare worker to military training consultant had been more difficult than she had anticipated. Saying goodbye to the children at Little Angels had been heartbreaking. 30 small faces looking up at her with confusion and betrayal, not understanding why Miss Sarah was leaving them to work with soldier people instead. But Miss Sarah, 5-year-old Emma had asked through tears, "Who's going to help us tie our shoes? Who's going to read us stories?" Tommy had added, his lower lip trembling. Sarah had knelt down to their level, fighting back her own tears. "I'm going to help train the Marines who protect all of us," she had explained. "Some of your mommies and daddies are Marines, and I'm going to help make sure they know how to be safe when they're far away from home." The children had eventually understood, after a fashion, but the guilt of leaving them had followed Sarah through her first week of preparation for her new role. Now, walking through the gates of Camp Lejeune, as the sun began to rise over the North Carolina landscape, Sarah felt the weight of the challenge ahead of her. She was about to enter a world where tradition was sacred, where methods that had worked for decades were not easily questioned, and where her success would be measured not in children's smiles, but in Marine survival. Gunnery Sergeant Hayes met her at the training headquarters, his expression professional but welcoming. "Miss Martinez, ready for your first day of changing how the Marine Corps trains its warriors?" Sarah managed a nervous smile. "I'm ready to try, Gunnery Sergeant. Though I have to admit, I'm not sure I'm prepared for what I've gotten myself into." "Ma'am, if you can handle 30 children at once, you can handle 30 drill instructors. The main difference is that the drill instructors are potty trained." The comment broke the tension, and Sarah felt some of her nervousness ease. Let's hope they're as eager to learn as the children were. Hayes led her to a conference room where 8 drill instructors were waiting. These weren't the same Marines she had worked with during her demonstration. These were senior instructors from across the base, men and women who had been training recruits for years and had been specially selected to evaluate her methods. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hayes announced, "this is Miss Sarah Martinez, the civilian contractor who will be working with us to develop enhanced marksmanship training protocols. As you've all been briefed, Miss Martinez demonstrated remarkable results with struggling recruits last week." The drill instructor studied Sarah with the intense scrutiny she was beginning to recognize as standard military behavior. Unlike the children at the daycare, these adults were evaluating her competence, her credibility, and her right to be in their world. "Miss Martinez," said Staff Sergeant Chen, a woman with close-cropped hair and sharp eyes, "we've heard about your demonstration. We're interested to see if your methods can be replicated with other groups of recruits." Sarah set her briefcase on the table and opened it, revealing her grandfather's carefully preserved materials. "Staff Sergeant, I appreciate your directness. I want to be clear from the beginning, I'm not here to replace your training methods. I'm here to share techniques that might complement what you're already doing." She pulled out a photograph of her grandfather in his Marine dress blues, taken shortly after World War II. "My grandfather, Staff Sergeant Roberto Martinez, spent his entire life studying marksmanship. His methods weren't just about hitting targets. They were about understanding the mental aspects of shooting under pressure." The drill instructors leaned forward, their interest clearly piqued by the mention of a Marine veteran's techniques. "The fundamental principle he taught me," Sarah continued, "is that accuracy comes from the mind, not from the weapon. He used to say that the rifle is just a tool. The real weapon is the Marine's ability to remain calm and focused under pressure." Gunnery Sergeant Hayes spread out several training schedules on the table. "Miss Martinez, we've arranged for you to work with 3 different groups of recruits over the next 2 weeks. Each group represents a different challenge. One group is struggling with basic marksmanship, another is having trouble with advanced techniques, and the third group consists of recruits who have shown potential but aren't reaching their full capability." Sarah studied the schedules, noting the careful organization and detailed planning that had gone into creating these training opportunities. "This is very thorough, Gunnery Sergeant. But I have a question. Will I be working with these groups alone, or will the drill instructors be observing?" "We'll be observing," Staff Sergeant Williams said. "The goal is for us to learn your techniques so we can incorporate them into our regular training programs." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "I understand the logic, but I'm concerned about the dynamics. Part of what made my initial demonstration successful was that the recruits weren't worried about being evaluated by multiple instructors simultaneously. They were focused on learning, not on avoiding mistakes." The comment created a moment of tension in the room. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, a veteran instructor with 15 years of experience, frowned. "Miss Martinez, these recruits need to learn to perform under observation. In combat, they'll be under constant pressure from their superiors and their peers. I agree completely, Staff Sergeant, Sarah replied. But there's a difference between productive pressure and counterproductive pressure. If we want these recruits to develop confidence in their abilities, we need to create environments where they can succeed first, then gradually introduce the pressure elements. So what are you proposing? Staff Sergeant Chun asked. Sarah pulled out her grandfather's training manual, a handwritten document that had been carefully preserved for decades. My grandfather developed a progressive training system. He started with what he called foundation building, helping Marines understand the mental aspects of shooting in a low-pressure environment. Once they demonstrated competence, he gradually introduced stress factors. She opened the manual to a page filled with detailed diagrams and notes. The key insight is that confidence is like a muscle. It needs to be developed gradually. You can't expect someone to perform at their best under maximum pressure if they've never succeeded under minimal pressure. Gunnery Sergeant Hayes examined the manual with obvious interest. This is remarkable documentation. Your grandfather was clearly a student of human psychology as well as marksmanship. He used to say that the best Marines weren't necessarily the ones with the best natural abilities. They were the ones who understood how to manage their own minds under pressure. Over the next 2 hours, Sarah walked the drill instructors through her grandfather's methods, explaining the psychological principles behind each technique. She demonstrated breathing exercises, visualization methods, and ways to build confidence through progressive challenges. What surprised her most was how receptive the drill instructors were to her ideas. Instead of the resistance she had expected, she found genuine curiosity and professional interest. Miss Martinez, Staff Sergeant Williams said as the briefing concluded, I have to admit, some of these techniques remind me of methods I've seen used in special operations training. The focus on mental preparation, the emphasis on building confidence, these aren't typically part of basic recruit training, but maybe they should be. Sarah felt a surge of hope. Staff Sergeant, I think the key is understanding that every Marine, whether they're a new recruit or a seasoned veteran, benefits from having confidence in their abilities. The question is how to build that confidence effectively. When do we start? Staff Sergeant Chun asked. Tomorrow morning, 0800 hours. Gunnery Sergeant Hayes replied. First group is 24 recruits who have been struggling with basic marksmanship for 3 weeks. They're scheduled for remedial training, which means they're already feeling defeated. Sarah closed her grandfather's manual and looked around the room at the faces of the drill instructors. These were professionals who had dedicated their careers to training Marines, and they were willing to try new approaches if it meant better preparing their charges for combat. I want to be clear about something, she said. I'm not expecting miracles. What I'm hoping for is to show these recruits that they can succeed, and to give you tools for helping future Marines develop confidence along with competence. Miss Martinez, Gunnery Sergeant Hayes said as the meeting concluded, your grandfather would be proud of what you're doing here. You're carrying on his legacy in a way that could help thousands of Marines. That evening, Sarah sat in her temporary quarters on base, reviewing her grandfather's notes and preparing for the next day's training. She felt the weight of expectation and responsibility, but also a growing sense of purpose. Tomorrow she would find out whether her methods could work consistently, whether she could train the trainers, and whether a daycare worker's insights could truly make a difference in how the world's finest fighting force prepared its warriors. The real test was about to begin. The morning of Sarah's first official training session arrived with a steady rain that turned the North Carolina landscape into a muddy challenge. As she walked toward the firing range at 0730 hours, 30 minutes before the scheduled start time, Sarah could see the 24 recruits already assembled in formation, their rain gear glistening in the gray morning light. These weren't the same recruits she had worked with during her initial demonstration. These were Marines who had been struggling with marksmanship for 3 weeks, who had been relegated to remedial training, and who carried the weight of repeated failure in their posture and expressions. 8 drill instructors stood at various positions around the range, clipboards in hand, ready to observe and evaluate every aspect of Sarah's methods. The pressure was unlike anything she had experienced in her years at the daycare center, where success was measured in children's laughter and growth rather than in the cold metrics of military performance. "Miss Martinez," Gunnery Sergeant Hayes said as she approached, "your test subjects are ready. These recruits have been through 3 weeks of intensive marksmanship training, and their scores are consistently below acceptable standards. Some of them are facing the possibility of being recycled to an earlier phase of training." Sarah studied the faces of the recruits, noting the familiar signs of defeat and anxiety she had learned to recognize in struggling children. The difference was that these weren't 6-year-olds having trouble with reading. These were young adults whose future careers as Marines might depend on their ability to hit targets consistently. "Gunnery Sergeant, before we begin, I need to understand something. How have these recruits been told about this training session?" "They've been told they're participating in an experimental training program designed to help Marines who are struggling with marksmanship fundamentals." Sarah winced slightly. "So they know they're here because they're failing." "That's correct, ma'am. That's the first problem we need to address." Sarah walked toward the formation of recruits, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air, "Good morning, Marines." "Good morning, ma'am." The response was sharp and precise, but Sarah could hear the underlying tension in their voices. "I want to start by correcting a misconception. You haven't been brought here because you're failing. You've been brought here because you're about to succeed in ways that will surprise everyone, including yourselves." A murmur of confusion ran through the formation, and Sarah could see the drill instructors exchanging glances. "My name is Sarah Martinez, and I'm here to share some techniques that my grandfather, Staff Sergeant Roberto Martinez, developed during and after his service in World War II. These techniques aren't about teaching you to shoot. You already know how to shoot. They're about teaching you to shoot while people are watching, evaluating, and expecting you to fail." The recruits' posture began to shift slightly, their attention focusing on Sarah's words rather than on the drill instructors who were observing them. "I want each of you to think about something you're good at, something you do well when you're relaxed and not being judged. It might be playing video games, fixing cars, playing sports, or any other activity where you've experienced success." Sarah walked along the front of the formation, making eye contact with individual recruits. "Recruit Johnson, what's something you're good at?" The young Marine looked nervous about being singled out, but answered clearly, "Ma'am, I'm good at playing guitar." "When you're playing guitar, are you thinking about all the ways you might make mistakes?" "No, ma'am, I'm thinking about the music." "Exactly. And when you're thinking about the music, do you make more mistakes or fewer mistakes?" "Fewer mistakes, ma'am." Sarah nodded and moved to the next recruit. "Recruit Williams, what about you?" "Ma'am, I'm good at working on engines." "When you're diagnosing a problem with an engine, are you worried about what other people think of your abilities?" "No, ma'am, I'm focused on finding the problem." "And when you're focused on finding the problem, do you work more effectively or less effectively?" "More effectively, ma'am." Sarah stepped back so she could address the entire formation. "The principle I want you to understand is this. Your brain performs best when it's focused on the task, not on the consequences of failure. Right now when you're shooting, you're not thinking about hitting the target. You're thinking about not missing the target. There's a crucial difference." She gestured toward the firing range. "Today, we're going to learn to shoot the same way you play guitar or fix engines, with focus on the process rather than fear of the outcome." Staff Sergeant Chun, who was observing from the side, stepped forward. "Miss Martinez, these recruits have been taught proper shooting techniques. The problem isn't their knowledge, it's their application under pressure." "Exactly, Staff Sergeant. And the pressure they're feeling isn't coming from the difficulty of the task. It's coming from their fear of disappointing the people who are evaluating them. Sarah turned back to the recruits. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to start with an exercise that has nothing to do with shooting, but everything to do with performance under observation. She walked to a table where she had placed a simple jigsaw puzzle, a 100-piece puzzle featuring a landscape scene. I want 5 volunteers to come forward and work on this puzzle while everyone watches. The request was so unexpected that several recruits looked confused. This wasn't what they had expected from marksmanship training. Recruits Martinez, Thompson, Davis, Rodriguez, and Park, please step forward. The 5 recruits approached the table, their movements awkward and uncertain. I want you to work on this puzzle for 5 minutes while everyone watches. The catch is that I'm going to be timing you, evaluating your performance, and the drill instructors will be taking notes on your technique. Sarah could see the immediate change in the recruit's demeanor. What should have been a simple, enjoyable task suddenly became a source of stress and anxiety. Begin. The 5 recruits started working on the puzzle, but their movements were jerky and uncertain. They dropped pieces, second-guessed their choices, and kept glancing nervously at the observers. After 5 minutes, they had made minimal progress. "Stop," Sarah called out. "How did that feel?" "Stressful, ma'am," Recruit Martinez admitted. "Why was it stressful?" "You've all worked on puzzles before." "Because everyone was watching, ma'am." Recruit Thompson replied, "Exactly. Now I want you to try the same puzzle again. But this time, I want you to ignore everyone who's watching. Focus only on the puzzle pieces, on finding where they fit, on the satisfaction of making connections." Sarah's voice became softer, more encouraging. "Remember what it feels like to work on a puzzle at home, when you're relaxed and enjoying the process. Let that feeling guide you." The change was immediate and dramatic. The recruits' movements became more fluid, more confident. They began working together, sharing pieces and insights. Within 5 minutes, they had completed more of the puzzle than they had in the first attempt. "Better?" Sarah asked. "Much better, ma'am," several recruits replied simultaneously. The same principle applies to marksmanship. The mechanics of shooting are simple: sight alignment, breathing, trigger control. But when you're worried about being evaluated, those simple mechanics become difficult. Sarah gestured toward the firing range. "Now we're going to apply this lesson to shooting. We're going to practice focusing on the process rather than the outcome." What followed was a masterclass in applied psychology. Sarah worked with the recruits individually and in small groups, helping them understand how their mental state affected their physical performance. She taught them breathing techniques that weren't just about oxygen control, but about creating mental calm. She showed them visualization methods that helped them focus on successful outcomes rather than feared failures. Most importantly, she gradually shifted the focus from avoiding mistakes to achieving success. "Recruit Johnson," she called out as one young Marine prepared to fire. "What's your target?" "To hit the center of the target, ma'am." "Wrong. Your target is to follow the process perfectly. If you follow the process perfectly, hitting the center will be the natural result." "What's the process, ma'am?" "Sight alignment, breathing, trigger control." Don't think about the target. Think about executing each step of the process with precision. The difference was subtle but profound. Instead of focusing on the pressure of hitting a specific point, the recruits began focusing on the mechanics of shooting. Instead of thinking about the consequences of missing, they began thinking about the satisfaction of executing proper technique. The results were remarkable. Within 2 hours, recruits who had been consistently missing targets were grouping shots in the center rings. More importantly, their confidence was visibly growing with each successful shot. Staff Sergeant Williams, who had been observing with increasing interest, approached Sarah during a break. "Miss Martinez, I have to admit, I was skeptical about psychological approaches to marksmanship training. But what I'm seeing here is undeniable. Staff Sergeant, the interesting thing is that we haven't changed the physical techniques at all. We've only changed how the recruits think about those techniques. That's what makes it so remarkable. These recruits know how to shoot. They've known how to shoot for weeks. But they couldn't perform under pressure. Sarah nodded toward the firing line, where recruits were now approaching their weapons with confidence rather than anxiety. The pressure isn't coming from the difficulty of the task. It's coming from their fear of failure. Once we address that fear, their natural abilities can emerge. Gunnery Sergeant Hayes joined the conversation. Miss Martinez, I'm seeing something I've never seen before in remedial training. These recruits are actually enjoying the process. Usually, by the time Marines reach remedial training, they're demoralized and defensive. That's because they've been labeled as failures, Sarah replied. But they're not failures, they're successful people who were temporarily overwhelmed by pressure. The morning session concluded with a live fire exercise that would have been impossible to imagine 3 hours earlier. 24 recruits, who had been struggling with basic marksmanship, were now shooting with confidence and accuracy. The transformation was so dramatic that several drill instructors requested permission to video the session for training purposes. But the real test came during the afternoon session, when Sarah stepped back and allowed the drill instructors to work with the recruits using the techniques they had observed. Staff Sergeant Chun, Sarah said, would you like to take over for the next group? Staff Sergeant Chun nodded, but Sarah could see the uncertainty in her expression. Miss Martinez, what if I can't replicate what you did this morning? Staff Sergeant, you don't need to replicate what I did. You need to apply the principles in your own way. The key is to focus on building confidence rather than identifying failures. What followed was a fascinating study in adaptation. Staff Sergeant Chun, working with a new group of struggling recruits, applied Sarah's techniques with her own military bearing and communication style. Instead of Sarah's gentle, nurturing approach, Chun used firm but encouraging guidance. Marines, Chun announced to the new group, you're here because you have the potential to be outstanding marksmen. We're going to unlock that potential by focusing on what you can do rather than what you've been struggling with. The approach was different from Sarah's, but the underlying principles were the same. Focus on process rather than outcome, build confidence through success, and create an environment where learning could occur without fear of immediate judgment. The results were nearly as impressive as the morning session. Recruits who had been failing basic marksmanship tests were hitting targets consistently within hours of beginning the new training approach. By the end of the day, 8 drill instructors had observed and participated in a training methodology that challenged everything they had been taught about how Marines learned under pressure. Miss Martinez, Gunnery Sergeant Hayes said as the session concluded, I think we need to have a serious conversation about expanding this program. What we've seen today isn't just an improvement in marksmanship, it's a fundamental shift in how we approach military training. Sarah packed up her grandfather's materials, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. Gunnery Sergeant, I think my grandfather would be amazed to see his techniques being used to train Marines 70 years after he developed them. Ma'am, I think he'd be proud to see that his granddaughter is carrying on his legacy in ways he never could have imagined. As Sarah walked back to her quarters that evening, she reflected on the day's events. She had successfully demonstrated that her methods could work with different groups of recruits and could be taught to experienced drill instructors. But more importantly, she had seen the transformation in the Marines themselves, the shift from fear to confidence, from failure to success. The daycare worker who had spent years nurturing children had found a way to nurture warriors, and in doing so had discovered a purpose she never knew existed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new groups of recruits, and new opportunities to prove that sometimes the most effective training comes not from breaking people down, but from building them up. The revolution in Marine Corps Training was just beginning. 3 weeks after Sarah's first official training session, word of her methods had spread throughout Camp Lejeune like wildfire. What had begun as an experimental program with struggling recruits had evolved into something much larger, a fundamental questioning of how the Marine Corps approached training in all areas, not just marksmanship. Sarah stood in the conference room of the base training headquarters, facing a gathering that would have been unimaginable just a month earlier. Present were not only the drill instructors she had been working with, but also senior officers from multiple training battalions, representatives from Marine Corps headquarters in Quantico, and even a civilian researcher from the Pentagon who specialized in military psychology. "Miss Martinez," said Colonel Harrison, the base commanding officer, "the preliminary results from your training program are remarkable. We're seeing improvements in marksmanship scores that exceed anything in our historical records. But more importantly, we're seeing improvements in overall recruit confidence and morale." Sarah felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about her grandfather's techniques anymore. This was about potentially changing how the entire Marine Corps trained its warriors. "Sir, I want to be clear about something. These improvements aren't magic. They're the result of applying basic psychological principles that have been understood for decades. The remarkable thing isn't that the techniques work, it's that they haven't been systematically applied to military training before." Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, the Pentagon researcher, leaned forward with interest. "Miss Martinez, what you're describing aligns perfectly with current research in performance psychology. The principles you're using focus on process over outcome, building confidence through incremental success, creating psychologically safe learning environments. These are the foundations of modern high-performance training. The question," Colonel Harrison continued, "is whether we can scale these methods across the entire Marine Corps training system. We're talking about training approximately 38,000 new Marines annually, plus ongoing training for active duty personnel." Sarah looked around the room at the faces watching her. These weren't just military officers. They were people who had dedicated their lives to creating the world's finest fighting force, and they were asking her to help them do it better. "Sir, I believe the methods can be scaled, but not by having me personally train every Marine. The key is training the trainers, teaching drill instructors and other military educators how to apply these principles within their existing curricula." Gunnery Sergeant Hayes, who had become Sarah's primary collaborator over the past weeks, stood up. "Colonel, Miss Martinez has already demonstrated that the techniques can be taught to other instructors. Every drill instructor who has observed her methods has been able to apply them successfully with their own groups." "That's true," Staff Sergeant Chun added. "But we've also discovered that the principles apply to more than just marksmanship. We've been experimenting with applying Miss Martinez's methods to physical fitness training, combat skills, and even leadership development." This was news to Sarah. She had been focused on marksmanship training and hadn't realized that her methods were being adapted for other areas of military training. "Can you give us some examples?" Colonel Harrison asked. Staff Sergeant Williams stepped forward. "Sir, we applied Miss Martinez's confidence-building techniques to a group of recruits who were struggling with the obstacle course. Instead of focusing on their failures, we focused on incremental improvements and process execution. The results were significant. Completion times improved by an average of 30%, and injury rates decreased substantially. Similarly," added Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, "we applied the psychological preparation methods to combat training exercises. Recruits who had been overwhelmed by the complexity of tactical scenarios began performing at much higher levels when we helped them focus on individual skills rather than overall performance." Sarah felt a mixture of pride and concern. "I'm encouraged that the principles are being adapted successfully, but I want to emphasize the importance of proper implementation. These techniques work because they're based on understanding how people learn and perform under pressure. If they're applied without understanding the underlying psychology, they could lose their effectiveness. Dr. Reeves nodded approvingly. Miss Martinez is absolutely correct. The danger in scaling any training innovation is that it becomes mechanized and loses its psychological foundation. The techniques she's developed work because they address fundamental human needs, the need for competence, autonomy, and psychological safety. Colonel Harrison studied a stack of training reports that had been compiled over the past 3 weeks. Miss Martinez, we're seeing quantifiable improvements across every metric we track. Marksmanship scores are up 40% among recruits who have received your training. More importantly, we're seeing improvements in overall graduation rates, reduced training injuries, and higher levels of recruit satisfaction. But sir, Sarah said carefully, I want to make sure we're not losing sight of the ultimate goal. The purpose of these techniques isn't to make training easier or more pleasant. It's to make it more effective. Marines still need to be prepared for the realities of combat. Absolutely, Colonel Harrison replied. But what we're discovering is that Marines who are confident in their abilities perform better under pressure than Marines who are anxious and demoralized. Your methods aren't making training easier. They're making it more effective. The meeting continued for another hour, with detailed discussions about implementation timelines, resource requirements, and the challenges of changing institutional culture. Sarah found herself at the center of conversations about topics she had never imagined: military budget allocations, Pentagon approval processes, and the complexities of implementing change across a massive organization. As the meeting concluded, Colonel Harrison approached Sarah privately. Miss Martinez, I want you to know that what you've accomplished here is unprecedented. In my 25 years of service, I've never seen a training innovation that has had such immediate and measurable impact. Thank you, sir. But I have to ask, what happens now? I'm a civilian contractor working on a temporary basis. If these methods are going to be implemented across the Marine Corps, they'll need institutional support that goes far beyond what I can provide. Colonel Harrison smiled. Miss Martinez, we've been in communication with Marine Corps headquarters. There's serious interest in creating a permanent position for you, something that would allow you to oversee the implementation of these techniques across all Marine Corps training facilities. The offer was both thrilling and terrifying. Sarah had never imagined that her grandfather's techniques would lead to a career in military training, but the opportunity to impact the lives of thousands of Marines was impossible to ignore. Sir, I'm honored by the offer, but I need to understand what it would involve. Would I be working directly with recruits, or would I be training instructors? Both, Colonel Harrison replied. We're envisioning a position that would involve developing training curricula, educating instructors, and conducting research into advanced training methodologies. You would essentially become the Marine Corps' expert on performance psychology and innovative training techniques. Sarah felt the weight of the decision before her. This was far beyond anything she had imagined when she first accepted the invitation to observe a training exercise. She was being offered the opportunity to shape how the Marine Corps trained its personnel for generations to come. Colonel, I need some time to think about this. It's a significant commitment, and I want to make sure I can deliver on the expectations. Of course. Take all the time you need. But Miss Martinez, I want you to understand something. You're not just being offered a job. You're being offered the chance to honor your grandfather's legacy while making the contribution to national security that could last for decades. That evening, Sarah walked the grounds of Camp Lejeune, reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 weeks ago, she had been a daycare worker whose biggest challenge was managing nap time for 30 children. Now she was being offered a position that could influence how the world's most powerful military force trained its warriors. She thought about her grandfather, about the techniques he had developed in the aftermath of World War II, about his belief that the best warriors were those who could find calm in the middle of chaos. She thought about the children she had worked with for years, about the joy she had found in helping them discover their own capabilities. Most of all, she thought about the Marines she had worked with over the past month, young people who had transformed from struggling recruits into confident warriors, not because they had learned new skills, but because they had learned to trust in abilities they already possessed. By the time she returned to her quarters, Sarah had made her decision. She would accept the position with the Marine Corps, but she would do it on her own terms. She would bring not just her grandfather's techniques, but her own insights about teaching, learning, and the power of believing in people's potential. Daycare worker was about to become something she had never imagined, an architect of warrior development, a keeper of traditions, and a bridge between the wisdom of the past and the needs of the future. Tomorrow, she would begin the most challenging phase of her journey, taking methods that had worked with individual groups and scaling them to transform an entire military culture. 6 months after Sarah had accepted her permanent position as the Marine Corps Director of Performance Training Psychology, she faced her greatest challenge yet. Standing in the auditorium at Marine Corps Base Quantico, she looked out at an audience of 200 drill instructors from across the United States, many of whom had traveled thousands of miles to attend what the Marine Corps had officially designated as Revolutionary Training Methodology Implementation Conference. The resistance was palpable. These weren't recruits who could be gently guided toward new ways of thinking. These were seasoned Marines who had built their careers on training methods that had worked for decades, and they were being told that a former daycare worker was going to teach them better ways to do their jobs. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium, "I know that many of you are here reluctantly. I know that some of you consider this conference to be a waste of time, and I know that some of you have serious doubts about whether a civilian can teach Marines anything about training warriors." A murmur ran through the audience, surprise at her directness, but also a grudging respect for her willingness to acknowledge the elephant in the room. "You're right to be skeptical," she continued. "I've never served in combat. I've never had to make life or death decisions under fire. I've never had to take young civilians and transform them into Marines in 13 weeks. Your skepticism is justified, and I respect it." The audience grew quieter, their attention focusing on Sarah's words. "But I want to share something with you that might change your perspective. 6 months ago, I was working with a group of recruits who had been labeled as failures. They were facing the possibility of being discharged from the Marine Corps because they couldn't meet basic marksmanship standards. Today, those same Marines are serving in active duty units, and their marksmanship scores are above average." Sarah clicked a remote, and the screen behind her displayed a series of before and after statistics that were impossible to ignore. The difference wasn't that these Marines suddenly became better shooters. The difference was that they learned to shoot without being paralyzed by fear of failure. And the techniques that help them overcome that fear are the same techniques that can help every Marine perform better under pressure. Staff Sergeant Morrison, a drill instructor from Marine Corps Recruit Depot San Diego, stood up. "Ma'am, with respect, what you're describing sounds like making training softer. Marines need to be tough. They need to be able to perform under pressure. If we coddle them in training, how will they handle combat?" The question was delivered with military courtesy, but Sarah could hear the underlying challenge. This was the core of the resistance she had been facing, the belief that psychological techniques were somehow incompatible with military toughness. "Staff Sergeant Morrison, thank you for that question. I want to address it directly because it gets to the heart of what we're trying to accomplish here." Sarah walked to the front of the stage, closer to the audience. "You're absolutely right that Marines need to be tough. They need to be able to perform under the most extreme pressure imaginable. But I want you to consider something. Which Marine is tougher, The one who is confident in his abilities, or the one who is constantly worried about failing? The confident one, ma'am, Morrison replied after a moment's consideration. Exactly. And which Marine is more likely to make good decisions under pressure? The one who has experienced success and learned from his mistakes in a supportive environment, or the one who has been demoralized by repeated failures? The one who has experienced success, ma'am, Sarah nodded. Staff Sergeant Morrison, you've just explained why these techniques make Marines tougher, not softer. We're not eliminating pressure from training. We're teaching Marines to perform effectively under pressure by building their confidence and competence systematically. Gunnery Sergeant Williams, who had been working with Sarah's methods for months, stood up. Ma'am, may I share something with the group? Of course, Gunnery Sergeant. I've been a drill instructor for 12 years. I've trained thousands of recruits. And I was skeptical of Miss Martinez's methods when I first heard about them. But I've seen the results firsthand. The recruits who receive this training don't just perform better on the range, they perform better in all aspects of their training. They're more confident, more resilient, and more capable of handling stress. But Gunnery Sergeant, called out another instructor, doesn't this approach take longer? We have 13 weeks to transform civilians into Marines. We don't have time for extensive psychological preparation. Sarah had anticipated this objection. Actually, Staff Sergeant, the opposite is true. When we build confidence and competence systematically, Marines learn faster, not slower. Instead of spending weeks trying to remediate failures, we prevent the failures from occurring in the first place. She clicked her remote again, displaying training timelines that compared traditional methods with her approaches. What we found is that Marines who receive psychological preparation at the beginning of training complete their requirements faster and with fewer setbacks than Marines who receive traditional training. The data was compelling, but Sarah could see that many of the instructors were still skeptical. Changing institutional culture was more complex than changing individual performance. I want to try something, she announced. I need 12 volunteers to participate in a demonstration. After some hesitation, 12 drill instructors came forward. Sarah divided them into 2 groups of 6. Group 1, I want you to perform a simple task, writing your name backwards while being timed. Group 2, you'll do the same task, but first we'll spend 5 minutes discussing performance anxiety and techniques for managing pressure. Sarah set up the demonstration carefully, working with Group 2 to help them understand how stress affected their performance and teaching them simple techniques for maintaining focus under pressure. When both groups performed the task, the results were dramatic. Group 1, despite being highly skilled Marines, struggled with the simple task because they were focused on being evaluated. Group 2, having learned to manage their mental state, performed the task quickly and accurately. This is what we're talking about, Sarah explained to the audience. These are the same techniques that help Marines shoot accurately under pressure, navigate obstacle courses efficiently, and make good decisions in combat situations. The demonstration had a visible effect on the audience. Drill instructors who had been skeptical began asking questions about specific applications of the techniques. Miss Martinez, asked Staff Sergeant Chun, how do we implement these methods without compromising the intensity that makes Marine training effective? Staff Sergeant, intensity and psychological preparation aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, they're complementary. When Marines are confident in their abilities, they can handle more intensity, not less. When they trust their training and their instructors, they can be pushed harder without breaking. The conference continued for 3 days, with Sarah and her team of experienced drill instructors demonstrating techniques, sharing case studies, and working with the instructors to adapt the methods to their specific training environments. Breakthrough came on the 2nd day, when Gunnery Sergeant Patterson, a notoriously tough instructor from Marine Corps Recruit Depot, Paris Island, stood up during a question and answer session. Miss Martinez, I've been a drill instructor for 15 years. I've trained over 2,000 Marines, and I've always believed that the harder you push recruits, the better Marines they become. But I've been watching your demonstrations, and I've been thinking about my own experiences. The auditorium grew quiet, everyone recognizing that this was a significant moment. I've seen recruits who were broken by training instead of built up by it. I've seen Marines who were so afraid of making mistakes that they couldn't perform effectively. I've always told myself that this was just part of the process, that the weak ones would be weeded out and the strong ones would survive. Patterson paused, his expression thoughtful. But what if I was wrong? What if some of those recruits who were weeded out could have been excellent Marines if they had been trained differently? Sarah felt a surge of hope. This was the moment she had been working toward, not just acceptance of her methods, but genuine understanding of their purpose. Gunnery Sergeant Patterson, that's exactly the question we should be asking. How many potentially excellent Marines have we lost because our training methods didn't account for individual learning styles and psychological needs? And more importantly, Patterson continued, how many Marines have we graduated who could have been even better if we had built their confidence along with their skills? The question hung in the air, and Sarah could see that it was resonating with many of the instructors. These were professionals who cared deeply about their mission, and the possibility that they could be more effective was compelling. By the end of the conference, something fundamental had shifted. The resistance hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had been replaced by curiosity and professional interest. Drill instructors who had arrived skeptical were leaving with plans to implement psychological training techniques in their own programs. Miss Martinez, Colonel Harrison said as the conference concluded, I think we've reached a tipping point. The institutional resistance is beginning to give way to institutional adoption. Sarah packed up her materials, feeling exhausted but hopeful. Colonel, I think we've made progress, but we're still at the beginning of this transformation. Changing how an entire military service approaches training is going to take years, not months. But we've started, Colonel Harrison replied. And that's what matters. Your grandfather's techniques are going to live on in ways he never could have imagined. 2 years after Sarah had begun revolutionizing Marine Corps training, she received a phone call that would test everything she had built. It was Colonel Harrison, now serving at the Pentagon, and his voice carried an urgency she had never heard before. Sarah, we need to talk. Can you be in Washington tomorrow? Of course, Colonel. What's this about? I can't discuss it over the phone. But I will say this. Your training methods are about to face their ultimate test. The next morning, Sarah found herself in a secure conference room at the Pentagon, surrounded by senior Marines whose rank and bearing indicated they were involved in the highest levels of military planning. The atmosphere was tense, and she could sense that something significant was happening. Miss Martinez, said General Patterson, a 3-star general she had never met, we've been following your work with great interest. The Marines who have been trained using your methods are showing remarkable performance improvements across all metrics. Thank you, sir. But I sense there's more to this meeting than a progress report. General Patterson exchanged glances with Colonel Harrison before continuing. Miss Martinez, we're about to deploy a Marine Expeditionary Unit to a combat zone. 30% of the Marines in this unit received training using your methods. The other 70% received traditional training. This deployment will be the first real-world test of whether your techniques translate to actual combat effectiveness. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. This was the moment she had been both anticipating and dreading, the point where her methods would be tested not in controlled training environments, but in the life-and-death reality of combat. Sir, I appreciate you informing me, but I'm not sure why my presence is required for this briefing. Because, General Patterson replied, we want you to understand the stakes involved. If your training methods prove effective in combat, We're prepared to implement them across the entire Marine Corps. If they prove ineffective, or if they contribute to mission failure or loss of life, we'll need to reconsider their use. The weight of responsibility was overwhelming. Sarah had always known that her work was about more than just improving training scores, but the reality of young Marines facing danger while carrying the influence of her methods was almost too much to bear. "Sir, I understand the implications. Is there anything I can do to support the deployment?" "Actually, yes," Colonel Harrison said. "We'd like you to be part of the post-deployment debrief team. When the unit returns, we want you to interview the Marines who received your training and evaluate how the techniques performed under combat conditions." 6 months later, Sarah stood in the same conference room, but the atmosphere was entirely different. The Marines who had returned from deployment were present, along with their commanders and a team of military researchers. The tension of the pavilion earlier meeting had been replaced by something she couldn't quite identify, a mixture of pride, amazement, and professional curiosity. "Miss Martinez," General Patterson began, "I think you'll find the results of this deployment illuminating." Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez, the commanding officer of the deployed unit, stood up. "Ma'am, I've been a Marine for 18 years. I've served in multiple combat deployments, and I've never seen anything like what we witnessed with the Marines who received your training." Sarah leaned forward, her heart racing. "What did you observe, Colonel?" "The Marines who received psychological preparation training performed at levels that exceeded our expectations in every category. Their marksmanship in combat situations was superior, their decision-making under pressure was more effective, and their overall stress management was remarkable." "Can you give us specific examples?" Colonel Rodriguez looked at his notes. "During one engagement, a fire team of 4 Marines, 3 of whom had received your training, was pinned down by enemy fire. Instead of panicking or making impulsive decisions, they methodically analyzed the situation, coordinated their response, and successfully neutralized the threat with minimal ammunition expenditure and 0 casualties. What made this remarkable?" Sarah asked. "The enemy position was in a location that required precision shooting at extended range under high-stress conditions. The Marines who had received your training were able to maintain accuracy and composure in a situation that would have been extremely challenging for even experienced combat veterans." Sergeant First Class Williams, one of the Marines who had been in that engagement, was invited to speak. "Ma'am, I want to tell you something. When we were taking fire, I remembered something you taught us during training about breathing and focus. Instead of letting the adrenaline overwhelm me, I used those techniques to stay calm and make accurate shots." Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes. "Sergeant Williams, you're saying that the techniques we practiced on the range actually helped you in combat?" "Yes, ma'am. But it wasn't just the shooting techniques. It was the confidence. I knew I could perform under pressure because I had learned to trust my training and my abilities. That confidence made all the difference." Other Marines began sharing their experiences. Stories of accurate shooting under impossible conditions, of maintaining composure during ambushes, of making good decisions when lives depended on split-second choices. "Miss Martinez," said Captain Thompson, a platoon commander, "the Marines who received your training weren't just better shooters, they were better Marines. They were more confident, more resilient, and more capable of handling the psychological stresses of combat." General Patterson studied the detailed after-action reports that had been compiled from the deployment. "Miss Martinez, the data is unambiguous. Marines who received psychological preparation training had significantly better performance metrics in every category we measure: marksmanship accuracy, decision-making speed, stress management, and overall mission effectiveness. More importantly," Colonel Harrison added, "they had lower rates of combat stress reactions and better post-deployment psychological health." Sarah felt a mixture of pride and humility. General, these results aren't just about the techniques I developed. They're about the drill instructors who learned to implement them, the Marines who were open to learning new approaches, and the entire military culture that was willing to embrace change. That's true, General Patterson replied. But it started with you having the courage to suggest that there might be better ways to train Marines. Your grandfather's techniques, filtered through your insights about human psychology, have proven themselves in the ultimate test. The meeting continued for several hours, with detailed discussions about implementation timelines, resource requirements, and the logistics of scaling the training methods across the entire Marine Corps. Sarah found herself at the center of planning. Sessions that would affect how hundreds of thousands of Marines would be trained over the coming decades. As the session concluded, General Patterson approached Sarah privately. "Miss Martinez, I want you to know that what you've accomplished here is unprecedented. In my 30 years of service, I've never seen a training innovation that has had such measurable impact on combat effectiveness. Thank you, General. But I have to say, the most important thing to me is knowing that these techniques are helping Marines come home safely. That's exactly why we're implementing them across the entire Corps," General Patterson replied. "Your work isn't just about improving training scores. It's about saving lives." That evening, Sarah walked through Arlington National Cemetery, reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about her grandfather, about the techniques he had developed in the aftermath of World War II, about his belief that the best warriors were those who could find calm in the middle of chaos. She thought about the children she had worked with at the daycare center, about the joy she had found in helping them discover their own capabilities. And she thought about the Marines she had trained, young people who had learned to trust in their abilities and who had carried that confidence into combat. At her grandfather's grave, he had been buried in Arlington with full military honors. Sarah placed a small American flag and spoke quietly to the headstone. "Grandpa, your techniques are now part of Marine Corps' doctrine. Marines all over the world are learning to shoot the way you taught me, and they're coming home because of it. I hope you're proud of what we've accomplished together." As she walked back to her car, Sarah felt a deep sense of completion. The daycare worker who had spent years nurturing children had found a way to nurture warriors, and in doing so had honored her grandfather's legacy while creating her own. The revolution in Marine Corps training was no longer an experiment. It was the new standard, and it would continue to shape how America's Marines prepared for combat for generations to come. 5 years after Sarah Martinez had first stepped onto a Marine Corps firing range, she stood once again in front of a formation of recruits at Marine Corps Recruit Depot Paris Island. But this time, everything was different. The young faces looking back at her weren't struggling Marines facing remedial training. They were the latest class of drill instructor candidates, men and women who would soon be responsible for training the next generation of Marines. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice carrying the confidence that came from years of proven success, "you are about to become part of a revolution that began with a simple idea, that the best warriors are not created through fear, but through confidence built on a foundation of competence and trust." The drill instructor candidates before her represented something remarkable, an entire generation of military trainers who had been educated from the beginning in psychological training principles. These weren't seasoned instructors learning to adapt to new methods. These were Marines who had been trained using Sarah's techniques and were now preparing to teach others using those same principles. "Staff Sergeant Martinez," called out one of the candidates, using the honorary rank that had been bestowed upon Sarah by the Commandant of the Marine Corps. "Can you tell us about the first time you worked with Marines?" Sarah smiled at the question. "I remember standing on a firing range, watching 30 young Marines who had been labeled as failures. They were convinced they couldn't shoot, and everyone around them was convinced of the same thing. But in 2 hours, we proved that the only thing standing between them and success was their fear of failure. She walked along the front of the formation, noting the confidence and professionalism in their bearing. The techniques we used that day are now standard Marine Corps doctrine. Every recruit who enters the Corps receives psychological preparation training. Every drill instructor learns to build confidence alongside competence, and the results speak for themselves. The statistics were indeed impressive. Since the implementation of Sarah's methods, Marine Corps marksmanship scores had improved by an average of 45%. More importantly, recruit graduation rates had increased, training injuries had decreased, and post-deployment mental health outcomes had improved significantly. But the real measure of success, Sarah continued, isn't in the statistics. It's in the letters I received from Marines serving around the world, telling me how the confidence they gained in training helped them make life-saving decisions in combat. After the session with the drill instructor candidates, Sarah walked across the base to a small building that housed the Sarah Martinez Center for Military Performance Psychology. The facility, dedicated 2 years earlier, had become the hub for research and development of advanced training methodologies for all branches of the military. Inside, she found Dr. Jennifer Walsh, her deputy director, reviewing the latest research. Findings from a study involving over 10,000 Marines. "Sarah, you need to see these results," Dr. Walsh said excitedly. "The longitudinal study is showing that Marines trained using your methods not only perform better in their initial assignments, but they also have better promotion rates and higher retention rates throughout their careers." Sarah examined the data, feeling a familiar sense of wonder at how far-reaching the effects of proper training could be. It makes sense when you think about it. If you start a Marine's career by teaching them that they can succeed under pressure, that confidence carries forward into every challenge they face. "There's something else," Dr. Walsh continued. "We're getting requests from other military services, police departments, and even civilian organizations who want to implement these training methods. The Department of Defense is considering making psychological preparation training mandatory for all military personnel." The scope of the impact still amazed Sarah. What had begun as an attempt to help struggling Marines with marksmanship had evolved into a comprehensive approach to human performance under pressure that was being adopted across the entire military. Her phone rang, and she saw that it was Colonel Harrison, now a general serving as the Director of Training and Education for the Marine Corps. "Sarah, I have some news that I think will interest you. The President is planning to visit Paris Island next month, and he's specifically requested to observe training using your methods. He wants to see firsthand how we're preparing Marines for the challenges of the 21st century." Sarah felt a familiar mixture of pride and nervousness. "General, I'm honored, but I hope he understands that what we're doing isn't revolutionary magic. It's just applied psychology based on principles that have been understood for decades." "Sarah, that's exactly what makes it so remarkable. You took established psychological principles and found a way to apply them to military training. The simplicity is what makes it genius." That evening, Sarah drove to the small cemetery where her grandmother was buried, just a few miles from the ranch where she had learned to shoot as a child. She placed fresh flowers on the grave and sat quietly in the gathering dusk. "Grandma, I wish you could see what we've accomplished. Grandpa's techniques are now being used to train Marines all over the world. And I think I finally understand what you meant when you said I needed to discover who I really was when I stopped hiding behind what felt safe." As she drove back to her hotel, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from one of the Marines she had trained during her first week at Camp Lejeune. The message was simple but profound. "Ma'am, wanted you to know that I just completed my second deployment. Used your breathing techniques during a firefight last week. They probably saved my life and the lives of my team. Thank you for teaching me to trust myself. Semper Fi." Sarah pulled over to the side of the road, tears streaming down her face. This was why she had left the safety and comfort of the daycare center. This was why she had faced down skeptical drill instructors and resistant military culture. This was why she had spent years traveling to bases across the country, teaching and learning and adapting. Not for the recognition or the awards or the research papers, but for messages like this one, simple acknowledgments that her work was helping young Marines come home safely to their families. The next morning, Sarah returned to Paris Island for one final event, the graduation ceremony for the recruit class that had been among the first to receive comprehensive psychological preparation training from the beginning of their time in the Corps. As she watched 300 new Marines receive their Eagle, Globe, and Anchor, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about the children at the daycare center who had taught her that every person had the potential to succeed if they were given the right support. She thought about her grandfather's techniques, developed in the aftermath of World War II, and now helping to prepare Marines for conflicts he could never have imagined. Most of all, she thought about the transformation she had witnessed, not just in the Marines she had trained, but in herself. The quiet daycare worker who had been afraid to stand out had become a leader in military training innovation. The woman who had found comfort in routine had learned to embrace the unknown challenges of institutional change. As the ceremony concluded and the new Marines celebrated with their families, Sarah felt a deep sense of completion. Her grandfather's legacy was secure, living on in the techniques that were now part of Marine Corps' tradition. Her own contributions had been validated through years of proven success in training and combat, but more than that, she had discovered something about herself that she had never fully understood. She wasn't just a teacher of children or a trainer of Marines. She was someone who could see potential in others and help them discover capabilities they didn't know they possessed. Whether working with 6-year-olds, learning to read, or 18-year-olds learning to survive in combat, the fundamental principles were the same. Believe in people's ability to succeed. Create environments where learning can occur without fear, and build confidence alongside competence. As Sarah drove away from Paris Island for the last time in her official capacity, she smiled at the thought of her grandfather watching from wherever Marines go when their final mission is complete. She had honored his legacy while creating her own, and in doing so, had ensured that his techniques would continue to serve Marines for generations to come. Years later, when military historians would write about the transformation of Marine Corps training in the early 21st century, they would point to that single shot on the North Carolina firing range as the moment everything changed. The moment when a daycare worker's quiet confidence silenced every drill instructor and proved that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin with the gentlest voices. Sarah Martinez had never set out to change the world. She had simply wanted to help people discover what they were capable of achieving. In the end, that was exactly what she had done. One Marine, one shot, one moment of perfect confidence at a time. The daycare worker who had once been afraid to dream beyond her small world had helped transform how the world's most powerful military prepared its warriors. It was, she reflected, a pretty good legacy for someone who had started out just trying to help children tie their shoes. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.